had a background in graphic design, and I ended up getting very interested in design for human experiences. I was working in e-commerce, and I saw more and more the value of the kind of human-centered research that we were doing and the way that it had a positive impact on our products. I started to look elsewhere at the nonprofit sector and the social impact sector to see ways that we could take some of these existing methodologies and apply it to problems that were beyond conversion rates on websites and essentially dollars and cents. So about 3 years ago, I came to Case Commons. They were a fledgling startup. We've grown exponentially since then, but we are focused on primarily creating digital tools for social workers. The landscape for the social worker and IT services that provide tools for them currently is a outdated scenario. What we have is technology that's mostly was developed in the late 80s and the early 90s, desktop products that have essentially unintuitive user interfaces and are actually much more focused on what we call mandated and retroactive data entry. That's essentially the bare bones data points that the federal government wants to record, and it's often recorded in a way that's essentially an afterthought to the work that they're doing in the field. I think for me, and maybe I was a naive user experience designer going into this 3 years ago, I think a big light bulb moment for myself was a manager pulled out and literally showed me a set of, I want to say, a half dozen binders where he was just handwriting and hand entering data because he just didn't trust the system. He didn't trust it from a back end of it crashing. He didn't embrace it as a user interface that was actually mirroring the way he thought about the information. So he created his own tool set. So there was a real light bulb moment, and that was something that has stuck with me. It's a real push right now to find measurable outcomes for children. They want to see that when a decision is made in a child's care, what impact did that child have? Did they find themselves reunited with their family? Were they put into adoption? And they want to start looking in a long-term and longitudinal way, that kind of outcome. The current picture of what's happening today is really a much more siloed experience. Data is captured, but it's often given to a third-party organization for analysis. It's not real time, and it's also very segmented from the actual social workers. A unique approach that we're bringing to this space is that we want to give meaningful data sets to not only the top level policymakers in the state, but also to boots on the ground workers and particularly their managers. We're learning a lot about how sort of mid-level managers, team leaders are actually really looking for those data sets to help them guide their social workers and help them remember and remind their social workers of how what they're doing can be measured and the impact they're actually having on the child. We want to create a software tool set that really highlights the disconnect between the ticking the box, entering the data points and the numbers, and what that actually means for a child in care. So whether that means putting more faces in the UI of the children, reminding the social workers of how many birthdays have been passed. We try to actually make software that not only is human-centered for the social workers, but it's also child-centered, that actually keeps the children at the forefront of the data. So human-centered design is actually one of the kind of core value adds that Case Commons is trying to provide to social services across the country. We see human-centered design as an ethos and a mantra that really drives all the decision-making that we invest in for new feature sets and product definition across the platform of our case management software. What that really means? Well, it starts with usability heuristics. When I started at Case Commons, I wanted to push that further. What we were noticing was that the collected data we had was clean and it was timely, but what was missing was the more robust adoption of the tools that were beyond the mandated federal data entry points. So for example, we have a family network diagram that actually shows a visualization of all the children, adults, and caregivers on a caseload, which could be a really valuable tool for sort of thinking longitudinally at the interconnectivity of different kids in your caseload, at realizing that maybe the same psychologist or even the same grandparent exists across two cases, and help to be more efficient and more impactful in the way that you address those different cases on your load as a social worker. So that tool, what we found, was definitely underutilized. And as we sort of investigated further and looked at the metrics, what we began to realize was that that we needed to go beyond heuristics, essentially. We needed to think essentially off the screen. We needed to go into the field. We needed to do ethnographic research. Essentially, we shadowed the social worker, and we needed to sort of observe their work environment. We wanted to see how data entry was happening today, because the old mental model of sort of the outdated filing cabinet that is only utilized because of mandates seemed to be persisting, and we wanted to see why that was, and what those barriers to adoption might be. But then beyond just observing those behavior sets, we wanted to actually listen to their personal stories, and that's really where we get into guided narratives. You don't want to overly frame their conversation, and that's sort of the difference between an interview and a guided narrative. An interview specifically has a set of very poignant questions that you want very finite answers to. A guided narrative is more about prompts. It's more about listening for those inner thoughts, those reactions, and those principles. And then sort of synthesizing and wading through that response and think about how are ways that our tool set can actually evolve to meet those needs, to sort of meet the social worker where they are. Essentially, social workers aren't spending a lot of time on their computer. They're actually in the field a lot, and that the computer is only one touch point in a much larger human services system. That helped us a lot to think about things like expanding to a more of a responsive web and mobile approach, where their headspace is physically and what they're thinking about on the day-to-day. A co-creation or a creative toolkit is essentially a set of tangible objects that are sort of purposely established and presented to a participant that they're encouraged to explore with, to be creative with. You'll see here we have a set of kind of widgets and a magnetic whiteboard that essentially gives that kind of frame. It's a way of asking participants who essentially aren't designers, they're not even necessarily technology people, to kind of look at that set of objects and sort of dream out loud with us. All of these elements of the creative toolkit were kind of peppered and seated on the table. They were kind of purposely left in a very democratically laid out space. And we were very curious to see what social workers would actually pick up, what their managers would pick up, what was meaningful to them, and sort of how they would kind of create their dream tool. A lot of workers were essentially seeing a disconnect between the data we were collecting and the data that really impacted their teams on a day-to-day basis. So on a day-to-day basis, a social worker is required to input any set of what we call practice metrics. They're essentially numbers that are required for federal reimbursement or tied to a court hearing. Where we're seeing a lack of adoption or interest in entering data that was tied more specifically to children, sort of the impact that the decisions are making on specific kids. So, for instance, if a child is removed from his home, how far is he removed from his home? Is he still in the same school district? Does he still have the same friends? We wanted to encourage social workers to help paint that picture with data. The outcome is essentially a set of personas, which are these archetypes of various users. They're kind of a way of synthesizing all the different things we heard from the different managers we spoke with and creating a compact set with unique labels that sort of spoke to the different ways that these managers were approaching data. Some of them were very qualitative and didn't want to talk about numbers at all. Some of them were essentially analysts, data analysts, and wish they had more widgets in their dashboard. What was great about that is it allowed us to sort of see the landscape and then be very strategic about where we put our efforts for the next feature set. I really recommend anyone starting a project to go deep early on with these human-centered design methods of observation and of guided narration to really make meaningful insights out of what's really happening today. Often the methods we use when creating products at Case Commons are lean and agile. That's something that we've tried to do with new product at Case Commons, is to get deeper with our human-centered design methodologies and let those insights really drive what the next product should be. One kind of rule of thumb is that qualitative research, exploratory research in general, often requires a smaller set, but because you go deeper with them, if you go, I'd say between 4 and 8 participants, you can actually get a lot of insights. And if you see a pattern that happens 3 or 4 times, you can actually make that assertion that it's probably going to happen. You're going to see it 20 to 30 times beyond that. Agile software development is very adroit at sort of engineering the expectations and the effort it takes to build a known quantity. But the problem is that known quantity oftentimes is an assumption. And it's hard to, once you go down that path, to actually do course correction. Even if you do learn from usability testing and from validation testing that things aren't working, you're kind of living in that user interface land again. If you're in a lean and agile or a tight timeline, then just get your crew together as soon as you're done. Talk about what it means, and then talk about actionable next steps. That's one nice thing about building things in an agile way, is that you kind of mitigate risk by making thin values of thin sort of layers of value, meaning that you don't have to build the whole thing. You can build the first step of that and validate that. And it may fail, but you did it quickly. So you can learn from what that failure and pivot and do that. That's kind of what agile is about, and change that direction immediately. Go deep with it, but then really dive into that synthesis and that meaning making that you get from what you've learned right away, and then very quickly translate that into something that could become product. Whether you're an artist, a policymaker, an engineer, anyone who's trying to enact change in a way that's positive for an outside audience, you're essentially a designer. And I mean that both as a way to encourage you to have confidence and the insights that you find through this kind of research, but I also mean it as an obligation that the decisions that you make truly do have an impact, particularly in social impact design. Really let the decision making and the choices that you move forward with grow from a true empathetic knowledge of the people you're impacting.